Entitled Corin calls cops on black woman. Regrets it when the attorney general calls. Ebony Wilson could feel the crisp autumn breeze against her cheeks as she walked through the tall wrought iron gates of Meadowlark Creek Estates, a suburban neighborhood where every house seemed to boast a lush, manicured lawn and flower beds brimming with seasonal blooms. The air tasted of change, a tinge of promise that both excited and unsettled her. This place was a world away from the urban apartment she had once called home, and as she looked at the broad streets lined with matching mailboxes and pruned hedges, she could hardly believe she'd finally saved enough to move here. The streetlights, spaced at perfect intervals, radiated a welcoming glow in the evenings. By day, friendly dog walkers passed by, often nodding and offering half-smiles as they led their pets along the well-maintained sidewalks. In her mid-30s, Ebony had worked her entire adult life to build a successful online retail business. She sold handmade jewelry and artisan crafts from around the world, products that carried stories of different cultures, infused with the warmth of skilled hands. She had come from a background where financial stability was never certain and had climbed the ladder through grit, resilience, and optimism. Ebony was proud of her achievements, determined to honor her grandmother's legacy. "Treat every human being like a future friend," her grandmother used to say. The older woman's voice still echoed within Ebony's mind whenever she felt uncertain or wary. Truth be told, Ebony knew that not everyone in life would treat her well, but she liked to believe that kindness could bridge divides when given half a chance. Today, Ebony was out on her usual morning walk. She liked to take in the scenery and breathe in the crisp air before settling into her home office. She wore a comfortable pair of black leggings, a lightweight jacket, and a pair of well-worn sneakers. Earbuds played her favorite jazz playlist, each note resonating like a soothing balm for her spirit. She was heading toward the small community park at the center of Meadowlark Creek Estates, a spot with a duck pond and a children's playground. It was her routine. Watch the ducks for a few minutes, maybe snap a quick photo for her social media, and then circle back. As she strolled, Ebony felt an acute sense of gratitude. She was living the life she had only dreamed of. The days of worrying about late rent payments and climbing endless flights of stairs in a cramped building were behind her. She didn't miss the city's daily noise and chaos, though she did miss the multicultural vibrancy. Here in Meadowlark Creek, she often felt like a singular presence, conscious of how her dark skin stood out among the mostly white neighbors. Yet, she believed that time and kindness would help her integrate. She yearned for a community where neighbors genuinely looked out for one another, sharing cups of sugar or swapping gardening tips. Her desire was simply to belong. She was just turning the corner onto Pine Hill Drive when she spotted a woman standing outside of a large white colonial house. The woman's short, ash hair was styled in a neat bob, and she wore a pastel cardigan that matched the pinkish hue of her perfectly manicured nails. In her arms, she cradled a small, fluffy dog, something that looked like a Maltese. Ebony had passed by this woman several times before, but had never formally introduced herself. There was something about the woman's gaze, cool and assessing, that made Ebony feel as though she were being measured and found wanting. Ebony tried a polite smile. The woman looked her up and down, then lifted her chin as if deciding whether to respond. Ultimately, the woman gave a curt nod, then turned toward her house and vanished indoors. Ebony let out a breath. Perhaps the woman was busy, or simply shy, she thought. But the coldness in the woman's posture reminded Ebony of times she'd been overlooked or dismissed in the past. She shrugged it off, refusing to let it spoil her morning. The sun was out, the breeze was gentle, and Ebony had a business call to look forward to later that morning with a potential client. Life was good, and she would let no one's aloofness take that away from her. Later that day, Ebony settled into her home office, a cozy nook with a large desk, ergonomic chair, and shelves lined with boxes of gemstones and jewelry supplies. Sunlight streamed through the window, giving the space a warm glow. Her cat, Pharaoh, a sleek black feline with bright green eyes, lounged atop a stack of shipping boxes, occasionally flicking his tail in contentment. Ebony put on her headset and prepared for her virtual conference with a new retailer who wanted to distribute her artisan crafts. These business calls had become her lifeblood, each one a small step toward fulfilling her dream of seeing her brand on shelves across the country. The meeting went splendidly, and Ebony's heart swelled with excitement. The retailer expressed interest in a preliminary order of 500 pieces. This would be one of the largest deals Ebony had ever negotiated. She silently thanked her grandmother for instilling in her a strong work ethic and a belief that genuine passion could open doors. She promised to follow up with a customized proposal by the next day, hopped off the call, and immediately began drafting notes in her journal. That afternoon, Ebony decided to take another walk for fresh air and renewed inspiration. She carefully packed up her notes, fed Pharaoh, and locked up. Stepping outside, she inhaled the crisp autumn air. The sun dipped lower, painting the neighborhood in a soft, golden hue. Children rode bikes along the sidewalks, their helmets askew, laughter echoing down the street. A sense of peace enveloped her. She decided to walk in the opposite direction this time, curious to explore more of the winding roads that made up Meadowlark Creek estates. After a few minutes, she came upon a house with immaculate hedges shaped into topiary animals, 2 giraffes and a large dog, from what she could tell. She paused to admire the artistry, stepping onto the sidewalk curb for a better angle. As she lingered, she heard a voice ring out from behind. "Hey, what are you doing there?" It was a sharp, accusatory voice. Ebony turned to see the same ash woman from earlier in the day. The woman stood on her front porch, arms folded across her chest, a frown etched onto her face. That same little dog yapped incessantly, as though echoing its owner's disapproval. "Hello, I'm just admiring the hedges," Ebony said softly, maintaining a polite tone. "Admiring the hedges, huh?" The woman's voice dripped with skepticism. "People have been lurking around the neighborhood, you know. We've had some suspicious activity recently." Ebony blinked, taken aback by the direct hostility. "I didn't realize," she said, glancing around. "I just moved here a few months ago and noticed these topiaries. They're quite impressive." The woman stared for a moment as though weighing Ebony's words, her eyes narrowing. She offered no word of neighborly welcome. Instead, she sniffed and muttered something under her breath that Ebony couldn't quite catch. Then with a curt gesture, the woman snapped. "Well, make sure you're not trespassing. It wouldn't be wise." She lifted her chin and pivoted on her heel, retreating into her house before Ebony could muster a response. Feeling a mixture of confusion and hurt, Ebony sighed and resumed her walk. Was she being unfairly singled out? She had done nothing but exist and take a moment to appreciate a neighbor's gardening. Nevertheless, Ebony reminded herself that she had found success in her life through determination, focusing on positive solutions rather than dwelling on negativity. She decided not to engage any further, though a knot lingered in the pit of her stomach. In the days that followed, Ebony noticed the woman, whose name she learned was Corin Caldwell, seemed to watch her whenever she passed by. Corin's eyes tracked Ebony's every move, from the length of time Ebony's trash bin remained at the curb on collection day to when visitors came to Ebony's front door. It was unsettling, like having a security camera trained on her every step. Once, Ebony even caught Corin pressing her face against a window as Ebony walked by. The moment Ebony turned her head, Corin jerked away as though scalded. At first, Ebony tried to brush off the bizarre behavior. Maybe Corin was simply an overly concerned neighbor, or perhaps she was lonely and didn't know how to interact with new people. Ebony told herself that not every cold reception was racially motivated, and that she had to be fair and open-minded. Nevertheless, Corin's relentless, watchful gaze felt personal. One late afternoon, after Ebony had finished packing a few shipments, she decided to grab a quick run around the neighborhood. She pulled on a hoodie and her favorite running shoes and set out. The streets were empty, quiet, and painted in the orange glow of the setting sun. The gentle, rhythmic thud of her sneakers on the pavement was meditative. She was rounding the corner near Corin's house, heart pumping and breath coming in soft huffs, when she heard shouting. At first, Ebony thought it might be children playing in a backyard, but the voice was unmistakably Corin's. She slowed to a jog and glanced in the direction of the commotion. Corin stood near her porch, phone in hand, her expression frantic. A tall teenage boy, maybe around 13 or 14, was standing on the sidewalk looking terrified. He was black, dressed in a simple gray sweatshirt and jeans, carrying a basketball under one arm. Ebony could hear Corin yelling about property damage and vandalism, though the boy was shaking his head, stuttering, "I'm just waiting for my mom." Something in Ebony's heart twisted painfully. She could sense the fear in that boy's eyes, an all-too-familiar fear that Ebony had experienced herself in countless subtle ways. She wanted to intervene, but she didn't want to escalate the situation either. Yet standing by felt wrong. She took a steadying breath and walked over, forcing calm into her steps. "Is everything all right here?" she asked quietly. Corin turned, her eyes flashing with hostility the moment she recognized Ebony. This young man was attempting to damage my mailbox, she accused, gesturing wildly toward her pristine mailbox with no visible mark or scratch. I wasn't, the boy whispered, trembling. I was only bouncing my basketball on the sidewalk, waiting for my mom to pick me up after practice. Ebony glanced at Corin's mailbox. There was no sign of vandalism, no damage. The boy looked utterly petrified, like a cornered animal bracing for punishment. The phone in Corin's hand was unlocked, the screen showing the dial pad for 911. Ebony calmly said, I don't see any damage to your mailbox. She softened her tone to reassure the teen. Everything's okay, nobody is hurt, could we maybe talk this out? Corin glared at Ebony, clearly aggravated by her presence. You mind your business, she snapped. If you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. This is a private matter. Ebony took a small step forward, ignoring the rude rebuke. It seems we have a misunderstanding. The mailbox is fine, and this young man said he's just waiting for his mother. Let's not blow this out of proportion. A moment of tense silence passed. Corin's gaze darted from Ebony to the boy, then back again. Finally, Corin let out a scoff. Fine, but I'll be keeping an eye on both of you. She jabbed a finger in the air. I won't tolerate trouble in this neighborhood. With that, she spun on her heel, marched up her porch steps, and slammed her front door shut behind her. Ebony exhaled, feeling the tension in her shoulders. She turned to the teen. You all right? The boy sniffed, hugging his basketball. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for stepping in. She came out yelling at me, telling me I was up to no good. Ebony offered a soft smile. I'm glad you're okay. If you need to wait somewhere else, you can stand by my driveway. It's just 2 houses down. I'll wait with you if you'd like. He nodded in gratitude and followed Ebony a short distance away. They made small talk until his mother arrived, a woman who looked relieved to see her son safe. Ebony waved them off, her heart aching at the memory of the boy's frightened eyes. She wondered if there was some deeper issue with Corin. Most neighbors in Meadowlark Creek estates waved politely, some even engaged in casual conversation. Corin Caldwell was the glaring exception, her hostility laid bare for anyone who didn't fit her preconceived notions. Another few days passed, and Ebony tried to go about her life without fixating on her neighbor's behavior. She channeled her energy into her business, finalizing the big retailer deal, which brought her immense satisfaction and a renewed sense of purpose. Pharaoh seemed to pick up on her good mood, curling around her ankles whenever she sang cheerfully around the house. Occasionally, she'd catch a glimpse of Corin scurrying by, that small dog in her arms, always glaring at Ebony if their eyes happened to meet. One day, Ebony decided to do something friendly, a neighborly olive branch. She baked a batch of cookies, wrapped them in a nice little tin, and walked over to Corin's house. She hesitated on the porch, reminding herself that not everyone would embrace her efforts. But Ebony believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. She rang the doorbell and waited, balancing the cookie tin in both hands. The dog barked from within, and eventually the door opened a crack. Corin's face emerged, eyeing Ebony with suspicion. Yes. Hi, Ebony said, her voice gentle. I live just down the street, and I wanted to bring over some cookies I made. I know we got off on the wrong foot, and I just want to, well, be a good neighbor. Corin's expression morphed into something Ebony could only describe as a sneer. You think I'm going to eat something from a stranger? She eyed the tin as though it were radioactive. No, thank you. Ebony felt heat rise to her cheeks. She forced a smile. No problem, I understand, I just wanted to say hi. Corin didn't respond, letting several seconds of awkward silence stretch before speaking. Please don't ring my doorbell again. I have a very busy schedule. Without another word, she slammed the door, leaving Ebony standing there, stunned and embarrassed. A whirlwind of conflicting emotions tore through Ebony as she made her way home with the unopened cookie tin. She felt foolish for trying, ashamed at how she had been treated, and upset at the blatant hostility she couldn't comprehend. Was Corin always like this, or was she specifically targeting Ebony for reasons Ebony preferred not to name? Deep down, Ebony's heart whispered that Corin's actions might be rooted in bias, maybe even racism. Yet Ebony still wrestled with the hope that there was something else at play, that she was misreading the situation. Life continued, and Ebony tried not to dwell on the negativity. She had a busy schedule, shipping out her biggest order to date. She even secured a spot at a local craft fair, which might further expand her reach. Still, Corin's watchful presence loomed in the background. If Ebony was pruning her roses, Corin would appear on her porch, arms folded, scrutinizing Ebony. If Ebony had friends or family visit, Corin seemed to materialize at her front window, peering out through half-drawn blinds. It felt like living under a microscope, but Ebony refused to be intimidated. The tipping point came on a Tuesday morning. Ebony had planned a small gathering for her craft collaborators, a group of mostly women representing various ethnicities and backgrounds. They were to discuss new jewelry designs and marketing strategies. Around mid-morning, Ebony and her guests gathered in the living room, sipping tea and talking excitedly about color palettes for the upcoming holiday season. It was an inspiring, laughter-filled meeting. Then came a commotion from outside. Someone knocked forcefully on the front door, rapid, authoritative pounding that made Ebony's heart jump. When she opened the door, 2 police officers stood on her porch, hands resting on their belts. Immediately, Ebony's stomach knotted. One officer, a tall man with close-cropped hair, introduced himself. "We received a call from a resident stating there was suspicious activity at this address. Reports of multiple individuals, possible break-in," he explained, voice low and tense. Ebony's breath caught. She took a calming moment before speaking. "Officer, I'm the homeowner, Ebony Wilson. There's no break-in here. I'm hosting a small gathering. Would you like to come in and see?" The officers exchanged looks, then nodded. Ebony stepped aside to let them in, her heart hammering. Her guests fell silent, confusion and concern etched on their faces as 2 uniformed officers inspected the living room. They quickly realized there was no crime, just a friendly meeting among colleagues. The second officer, a woman, turned to Ebony. "We apologize for the disruption, ma'am. Sometimes the dispatch gets calls that turn out to be misunderstandings. We have to follow protocol, though." Ebony cleared her throat, trying to maintain her composure. "Understood," she replied. "May I ask who called you?" The officers exchanged another glance. Their silence told Ebony all she needed to know. She cast a fleeting glance out the window. Across the street, Corin was standing in her front yard, phone in hand, glaring straight at Ebony's house. The officers noticed her too, then the female officer sighed. "We'll just file that this was a mistaken report," she said quietly, as if reading Ebony's mind. "We're sorry for the inconvenience." Ebony thanked them for their time and politely shut the door behind them, her guests looking rattled. One friend, a Kenyan artisan named, shook her head in dismay. "This is unacceptable," she murmured. "That woman was standing out there staring at us." Another friend, an Asian American craft distributor named, clenched her fists. "I've never seen anything like this. Who calls the police on a simple gathering?" Anger, humiliation, and a sense of injustice flared in Ebony's chest, but she put on a brave face for her guests. "I'm so sorry about that," she said, voice trembling slightly. "Let's move on with our meeting, but if any of you feel uncomfortable or want to leave, I completely understand." To Ebony's relief, none of her guests left. They expressed solidarity, hugging Ebony and offering words of comfort. Even teased, "Hey, at least we're safe. There's a watchful sentinel across the street, though quite an unwelcome one." The group tried to return to normal conversation, but an undercurrent of unease persisted. Ebony couldn't shake the intrusive feeling that no matter how much success she achieved, no matter how friendly she tried to be, there would always be people eager to see her fail or to cast her as a suspect. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Ebony sat alone in her living room, the teacups and pastry trays still cluttering the coffee table. Pharaoh curled at her side, purring softly, offering silent comfort. Ebony's heart felt heavy with a question she'd asked herself countless times throughout her life. Why? Why must she endure suspicion, fear, and hostility, just because of who she was or what she looked like? She resolved not to let Corin's actions go unchecked. Sooner or later, this behavior had to stop, for Ebony's sake, and for others who might also be victimized. She found herself browsing local community guidelines, homeowners association rules, and any official complaint procedures. At the very least, Ebony could document this harassment, though she worried it might escalate. A week passed with no major incidents, but Ebony felt an underlying tension whenever she spotted Corin, as though something was simmering beneath the surface, ready to explode. Ebony's worst fears came true one chilly morning when she decided to go for a run before sunrise. Dressed in black leggings and a navy hoodie, she set out at dawn, the sky just beginning to lighten. The neighborhood was peacefully still. She ran with purpose, trying to focus on the rhythmic sound of her feet instead of her swirling thoughts. Halfway through her route, bright headlights flooded the street behind her. She glanced back to see a police cruiser creeping along slowly. Alarm bells rang in her mind. Could it be that Corin had called the cops again? Ebony's heart hammered as she tried to maintain her pace, hoping the cruiser would simply pass by. But it did not. Instead, the flashing lights came on, and a short burst of a siren startled her so violently that she stumbled to a stop. The window rolled down, revealing an officer who didn't look familiar. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called. "We received a call about suspicious activity in the area." Ebony's throat felt tight. She swallowed hard. "I'm just out for a run, officer. I live here on the next block." He got out of the cruiser and approached, hand lingering near his holster. "Could I see some ID?" he asked, his tone neutral but commanding. Ebony's cheeks burned with shame. ID? She had not brought her wallet on a morning run. "Who does that?" She explained as much, feeling her voice tighten with anxiety. "I wasn't expecting to need it. I'm just jogging in my own neighborhood." The officer glanced around, clearly scanning for any sign of wrongdoing. "We got a call about a possible break-in suspect wearing a dark hoodie," he said. "Someone said you were peering into windows." Ebony's eyes immediately shot to a nearby house. Did Corin actually claim Ebony was some kind of prowler? Ebony explained with forced calm. "I'm on my normal route. I haven't done anything except run down this street." She offered her address, pointed down the road. The officer studied her, his expression revealing neither sympathy nor hostility, just a robotic adherence to procedure. After a tense minute of Ebony standing there in the cold morning air, the officer finally seemed to accept her explanation. "All right, ma'am. Let's not have any more calls like this." The moment he stepped back into his cruiser and left, Ebony felt tears burning in her eyes. She'd never been so humiliated, singled out in her own neighborhood for merely existing. She wrapped her arms around herself, the morning breeze biting her cheeks, and walked home with her head lowered, her run unfinished. By the time she reached her house, she was shaking with anger and frustration. She realized that enough was enough. This pattern of harassment couldn't be allowed to continue. It wasn't just about Ebony's personal dignity, it was about the principle. Corin was weaponizing law enforcement against law-abiding neighbors, purely based on prejudice or an inflated sense of entitlement. Ebony felt a responsibility to stand up for herself, and for others who might be too frightened or powerless to do the same. Over the next few days, Ebony documented everything. Dates, times, what happened, which officers responded, and any evidence she could gather. She spoke to the teen boy's mother, Chase was his name, and learned that Corin had repeatedly harassed him and his friends when they played basketball in the neighborhood park. Ebony also discovered a few neighbors who had faced smaller but still distressing incidents. Corin complaining about them being too noisy during a simple backyard barbecue, or reporting them for violations that didn't exist. Finally, Ebony felt equipped to take more serious action. She knew a lawyer from one of her craft cooperatives, a woman named Lorraine who specialized in civil matters. After hearing Ebony's story, Lorraine agreed there was a strong case for harassment and possibly discrimination. They began the process of filing a complaint with the local authorities, detailing Corin's pattern of placing baseless emergency calls, which in many jurisdictions can be considered a crime itself, filing false reports. While the legal wheels began turning, Ebony received a tip from another neighbor, an older man named Mr. who'd lived in Meadowlark Creek for decades. He told Ebony that Corin Caldwell had connections to the local homeowners association and was rumored to be dating a man with ties to city officials. Ebony felt a chill. Could that explain why Corin felt emboldened to act this way? Perhaps she believed she was untouchable, that her phone calls to the police would never be challenged. Days turned to weeks, and Ebony's complaint worked its way through the bureaucratic system. She sometimes doubted herself, wondering if this was just a colossal waste of time. But she couldn't let the fear of an uphill battle stop her from seeking justice. Several neighbors quietly voiced their support for Ebony, though some were too afraid to speak publicly, worried that Corin would retaliate against them as well. Then one afternoon, something changed. Ebony was in her living room, finalizing an invoice, when she heard loud knocking at Corin's door across the street. Urgent, official-sounding knocks similar to what Ebony herself had experienced. She peered out her window and saw two individuals in formal suits, accompanied by a uniformed officer. They flashed badges and waited for Corin to answer. Corin opened the door, her posture stiff, confusion etching her face. There was a brief exchange Ebony couldn't fully hear, but Corin's features paled, and she seemed to slump back against the doorframe. It was hours later, well after the suited individuals departed, that Ebony discovered exactly what had happened. Lorraine called her with the news, barely containing her excitement. "You won't believe this, Ebony," Lorraine said, voice buzzing. "Your complaint, combined with several other recent complaints about false emergency calls, was forwarded to the State Attorney General's office for review. The AG has decided to launch an investigation into Corin Caldwell for possible civil rights violations and abuse of emergency services." Ebony's mouth fell open. She had assumed, at best, Corin might get a warning or a fine for misusing 911. But an investigation from the State Attorney General meant a level of scrutiny Ebony never anticipated. Lorraine explained that the local authorities had grown concerned with the pattern of calls from Corin's number. When Ebony's case was included, along with testimonies from other neighbors, it painted a picture of a malicious pattern. The suspicion was that Corin was targeting individuals of color with fraudulent police reports. The news sent a ripple of tension and excitement through Meadowlark Creek estates. Word spread quickly that the state's top law enforcement officer was looking into Corin Caldwell's actions. Some neighbors expressed shock, others relief that justice might be on the horizon. Ebony felt a swirl of emotions, vindication, wariness, and cautious hope. She was grateful that someone with real authority was taking notice, but she also worried about backlash or anger from Corin. Her concern wasn't unfounded. Corin's anger manifested almost immediately. She paced in her yard, sometimes screaming into her cell phone. Ebony could catch glimpses of Corin's red, tear-stained face, the small dog yapping at her feet, as Corin ranted about ungrateful neighbors, ridiculous allegations, and a witch hunt. Ebony went about her routine as best she could, ignoring Corin's histrionics and focusing on her business. She tried to keep a low profile, but she was aware that the neighborhood was buzzing with gossip. A week later, Ebony returned from a quick grocery trip to find a local news van parked at the entrance to Meadowlark Creek Estates. A reporter was doing a stand-up segment about false emergency calls leading to a statewide investigation. Ebony's pulse pounded as she realized the story had made it to the press. Did she want to speak out? She debated whether to share her experiences publicly or not. Part of her wanted to remain private, but another part of her recognized an opportunity to create real change. Ultimately, Ebony reached out to the reporter. In a carefully arranged interview, Ebony spoke about her experiences in general terms, ensuring she didn't interfere with any ongoing investigation. She described the repeated false reports, the humiliation she felt, and the fear that, one day, a call like that could escalate into a tragic situation. The reporter listened intently, and Ebony's words were broadcast later that evening. Messages of support trickled in through social media, while Ebony steeled herself for potential hostility. Corin's reaction was swift. Late one night, Ebony heard pounding at her front door. She froze. Pharaoh darted under a table, fur on end. Ebony looked through the peephole and saw Corin herself, standing outside, eyes wild with rage, the small dog nowhere in sight. Ebony refused to open the door, but she could hear Corin's muffled voice shouting something about lies and ruining my life. Ebony dialed the local non-emergency line, reporting that a distressed neighbor was causing a scene. By the time an officer arrived, Corin had stormed off. Ebony filed yet another incident report. The following morning, Ebony found a typed note slipped under her door. It wasn't signed, but Ebony recognized the voice. "You think you can destroy me? You'll regret this," it read. Ebony's hands trembled. She placed the note in a plastic bag as evidence and alerted Lorraine. The next day, Ebony sent the note to the investigators from the Attorney General's office. They thanked her and assured her they were taking all aspects of the situation seriously. Days rolled by, each one layered with a mix of tension and hope. Ebony tried to keep her routine morning walks, business calls, shipping orders, but she remained on edge, half expecting another confrontation. Corin, meanwhile, seemed to unravel publicly. Neighbors whispered about her shouting matches with her boyfriend, or the times police showed up at her home to question her. The strife seemed to be taking its toll, yet Ebony felt neither triumph nor glee. She only wished Corin had stopped before it came to this. Then came a pivotal moment. Ebony received a phone call from the State Attorney General's office. A representative politely asked if Ebony would be willing to testify in a formal hearing about Corin's pattern of harassment. Ebony's heart pounded. This was real. Corin's actions might have violated state civil rights laws, and Ebony's voice could be key to holding her accountable. Ebony agreed, though her nerves were fraught. She worried about stepping into a public legal proceeding. but she understood the stakes were higher than her personal comfort. On a clear morning, Ebony dressed in a modest blouse and slacks and headed to the state building where the hearing was to take place. Lorraine accompanied her, offering quiet reassurance. They were joined by a handful of others who had faced Corin's baseless calls or harassment. Even the teenage boy, Chase, came with his mother. Seeing them bolstered Ebony's courage. She realized she wasn't alone. Inside a modest hearing room, state officials and attorneys laid out the accusations. Repeated false calls to emergency services, targeting individuals based on race, creating a public disturbance and potential civil rights infringements. Corin sat at a table with her own legal counsel, face pale, lips set in a grim line. She occasionally glared at Ebony, but Ebony held her gaze, determined not to be intimidated. The hearing was intense. Testimonies painted Corin as a vigilante with an unhealthy fixation on controlling who belonged in the neighborhood. The 911 records, which the state had subpoenaed, were damning. They showed a clear pattern. Nearly all of Corin's calls were directed at residents or visitors who were people of color, accusing them of vague or non-existent crimes. The repeated nature of these calls, coupled with the lack of any substantiating evidence, lent credence to the argument that Corin was abusing the system. When it was Ebony's turn to speak, her voice quavered slightly, but she spoke her truth. She recounted the day the police showed up during her business meeting, the humiliating early morning run where she was forced to prove her innocence, and the intimidation she felt in her own home. She described the emotional toll, how her home, a place meant to be a sanctuary, felt violated by the constant threat that at any moment, law enforcement might be summoned based on unfounded suspicions. Corin's attorney tried to discredit Ebony's account, implying Ebony was exaggerating. But Ebony's composure held. She answered each question plainly and respectfully, citing specific dates and times. She provided phone records that matched Corin's calls to the police. The more Ebony spoke, the quieter the room became, as though everyone was collectively appalled by the pattern emerging. Corin herself eventually took the stand, attempting to portray herself as a concerned neighbor who was only looking out for everyone's safety. She insisted she had no bias, that she called the police whenever she saw something suspicious. But under cross-examination, Corin's statements began to unravel. She contradicted herself about specific incidents, trying to claim she had evidence of wrongdoing but was unable to provide any. At one point, she lost her temper, snapping at the state's attorney. Gasps rippled through the room. Corin's facade of civility cracked, revealing the anger and entitlement beneath. After hours of testimonies and evidence, the hearing concluded. The panel overseeing the case announced they would deliberate and deliver their findings within a few weeks. Ebony and the others left with a sense of weary accomplishment. They had done their part. They had faced down Corin in an official setting, telling their stories under oath. Yet Ebony knew the process was far from over. In the days that followed, Ebony tried to return to normalcy. She immersed herself in her jewelry designs, focusing on uplifting motifs, pieces that symbolizes unity, hope, and resilience. Pharaoh helped by periodically knocking small items off her desk, forcing Ebony to chase them around the room, which brought a bit of light-hearted distraction. About 3 weeks after the hearing, Ebony received another call, this time from one of the investigators in the Attorney General's office. The panel found sufficient grounds for legal action, the investigator explained. Corin Caldwell could face significant penalties for filing false police reports and civil rights violations if our lawsuit is successful. Ebony felt a surge of relief flood her veins. Relief for herself, for that teen boy, and for anyone else Corin had harassed. A local judge allowed the case to proceed. At that point, media outlets picked up the story again, framing it as a cautionary tale of how entitlement and prejudice can lead to serious legal consequences. Corin's name appeared in headlines, often under variations of "Local Woman Faces Investigation Over 911 Abuse." Neighbors who once defended her or ignored her actions began to distance themselves. Ebony heard gossip that Corin's partner had left, that her job was on the line, and that her membership in the Homeowners Association had been suspended. Though Ebony felt a pang of sympathy, no one wanted to see another person's life collapse. She remembered the note Corin slipped under her door, the repeated lies, the terror in that teenage boy's eyes. Around this time, Ebony noticed subtle but meaningful shifts in the neighborhood. A few people who rarely acknowledged her before suddenly offered friendly waves. The mother of one of Ebony's acquaintances in the community brought over homemade muffins, apologizing for having stayed silent so long. It seemed that Corin's downfall was inspiring others to reflect on their own complicity or inaction. For Ebony, the lesson was bittersweet. It took a full-scale legal investigation for her to feel truly welcomed. Still, she embraced the kindness where it was sincere, grateful that at least some hearts were opening. Eventually, the Attorney General's office announced a settlement agreement. Corin Caldwell, in an attempt to avoid a protracted and very public legal battle, accepted responsibility for filing multiple false reports and agreed to pay substantial fines. She was also mandated to attend a series of anti-bias and community service programs. Although Ebony wasn't privy to all the legal nuances, she knew that a portion of Corin's fines would go to a civil rights fund aiding victims of harassment. The day the settlement was made public, Ebony walked outside to get her mail and spotted Corin clearing out her mailbox across the street. Their eyes locked for the briefest moment. Corin's posture was defeated, her cheeks hollow, skin pale. Ebony felt an inexplicable wave of compassion, even while remembering all the pain Corin had caused. She considered offering a nod of acknowledgement, but she remained still. Corin looked away first, hurried back inside her house, and shut the door. Ebony exhaled, a swirl of emotions playing in her chest, anger, relief, pity, and something akin to closure. In the weeks that followed, Ebony continued to rebuild a sense of safety in her home. She gradually relaxed her watchful stance, letting herself enjoy morning walks and evening strolls without the same pervasive anxiety. She met with neighbors, some of whom had also been Corin's targets, forming new friendships forged through solidarity. Together, they discussed ways to keep the neighborhood genuinely safe and welcoming for everyone, creating a neighborhood watch that focused on constructive, not paranoid, vigilance. They hoped it would deter crime, not target innocent people. Life never returned to exactly how it was before, but it evolved. Ebony's business flourished. Her new lines of handcrafted jewelry, each piece carrying a theme of unity or resilience, sold out faster than she could restock them. She gave part of her proceeds to nonprofits that advocated against discriminatory policing. She was determined to ensure that something positive would come from her harrowing experiences. As for Corin Caldwell, rumors circulated that she had put her house up for sale. Some said she planned to move to a different state to avoid the stigma that now clung to her name. Others claimed she remained in town, quietly residing in her home, seldom venturing out except for errands. Ebony never quite discovered the exact truth. She only knew that the frenetic, watchful presence across the street had gone silent. Corin's porch light rarely flickered on in the evenings, and the little dog was never seen barking in the yard anymore. It was as if Corin had become a ghost in the place she once tried so desperately to control. On a breezy autumn afternoon, months after the legal settlement, Ebony found herself leaning against the fence in her backyard, sipping a mug of steaming tea. The trees danced in a gentle wind, their leaves rustling like whispered secrets. She reflected on everything that had transpired, remembering the moment she first locked eyes with Corin, the fear she felt when the police lights flashed during her morning run, the tears that burned when she realized someone could hate her simply for existing in a space they felt was theirs alone. Yet here Ebony stood unbowed. She recalled her grandmother's old saying, "Treat every human being like a future friend." Ebony had tried, she had offered cookies, politeness, and understanding. Corin rejected it all. Yet Ebony's heart remained open, if a bit more guarded. She had discovered a quiet resilience within herself, a resolve not to be diminished by another person's prejudice. And now, as Ebony closed her eyes, she imagined a future where people learned from stories like hers. A future where calling the cops on innocent neighbors was not an act of entitlement or fear, but recognized as a dangerous act of hate with real consequences. In that future, Ebony envisioned communities built on genuine trust, dialogue, and mutual respect. That vision gave her hope, reminding her that progress might be slow, but it was still worth pursuing. The moral of Ebony's journey was clear. No one is above accountability, and hate-fueled actions, however seemingly small or subtle, can ripple out and cause deep harm. Yet justice, when pursued with patience and integrity, can catch up to those who believe they are untouchable. If Corin's calls had succeeded in terrorizing Ebony into silence, Ebony would have been just another statistic, another voice stifled. Instead, Ebony's refusal to be silent and her willingness to stand up for herself and others sparked change. It was a reminder to everyone that we have a duty to confront injustice, even if the path is daunting. In the end, Ebony's life in Meadowlark Creek Estates found a new equilibrium. She recognized that prejudice still existed in the world, but she also experienced firsthand the power of standing together with a community. Neighbors who might once have been strangers, but who now, through adversity, found a shared resolve for fairness. Meadowlark Creek was no perfect Eden, yet it was on a better path, with more honest conversations about inclusion and safety. Ebony breathed easier in the place she called home, determined to keep shining her light. If Corin had taught her anything, it was that hatred festers in the shadows of entitlement and ignorance. Calling the cops to assert a twisted sense of superiority may bring a fleeting satisfaction to some, but the higher truth is that the arc of accountability can bend toward them sooner or later. When it did, Corin found herself under the scrutiny of the highest law enforcement officer in the state, her life upended. Ebony could only hope that perhaps Corin would learn something from the entire ordeal, perhaps that fear and prejudice breed consequences, and that no matter how strong your sense of entitlement, there is always a reckoning at the end of the road. And so, as autumn leaves fell around Ebony in a gentle cascade of reds, oranges, and golds, she looked toward a future shaped by her courage, buoyed by a circle of supportive friends, and guided by the simple yet powerful principle of standing up for what is right. Her heart was but steadfast, her spirit tested yet unbroken. She walked back into her home, Pharaoh greeting her with a soft purr, and resumed her life, more assured than ever that her worth was not defined by the biases of others, but by the truth she carried within. In that truth, she found both peace and power, the twin anchors of a life well lived, in a world that, step by step, is learning to confront the cost of letting intolerance run free.